Okay, we are live. Hi, everyone, and
Good
welcome
evening.
to Alan. Welcome to Alan and Dara here with us.
Thank you. Thank
I'm
you.
just going to give it a few minutes here to let people into the room. So if anyone's just joined us, we're just going to give it another minute or two just to let a few more people come and join us live. So again, just for anyone who has joined us, we're just giving it one more minute to allow people to join us live, as people are just linking on YouTube at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'll be boring you all with introductions and stuff, such anyway. So even if you jump on and miss my titter chatter, you won't miss the main event, which will be Alan and Dara in conversation. So thank you all for joining us this evening on the Friday of a bank holiday. So we're delighted that you are here, and obviously we'd much prefer if we could all be in person and have an interesting debate around the topics that have come up and that generally come up as part of Project Cleanfit, Dara McGrath's exhibition and project that is currently showing with us in the Art Centre behind closed doors. Hopefully any of you who have had a chance will have logged on to our website and will have had a chance to have a look at our virtual exhibition, as well as some of the images and installation shots, so to kind of get a sense of the exhibition, even though you couldn't be there in person. We will be closing the exhibition tomorrow officially, so this evening is the kind of closing event as part of Dara's project, and we would like to thank Tipperary County Council and the Arts Council for the support in allowing us to go ahead with this exhibition and deliver it virtually and online in the way that we've been able to. We will, with the new guidelines, hopefully be opening our doors again on the 10th of May. So hopefully we'll see some of you in person again. And unfortunately for Dara, the show wasn't meant to be seen, but it means that other shows of his will be seen. So that's the main thing. So before I hand over, I'm just going to do a little bit of a boring chit chat just to give you a little bit of background on Dara and Alan, and then I will hand over without any further ado. Just to say as well that if there are any questions throughout the conversation, we will be allocating time at the end for a kind of Q&A session. So if there's any questions, please type them in the chat on the YouTube, and myself and Emer will be moderating those there, and we will bring them to the attention of Dara and Alan at the Q&A at the end. So just let us know, maybe put a Q before it or just say question and type it in, and we'll keep an eye on the chat there. So Dara is a photographic artist based in Cork. The central concern of his work is in exploring transitional spaces, those in-between places where architecture, landscape, and the built environment often intersect, and where a dialogue of absence rather than presence is created. Project Cleanfit is a long-term photographic and visual investigation into the landscapes and sites of chemical and biological weapons. The work focuses on the impact of human action and inaction on these sites, many of which appear at first glance to be sublime. He's exhibited in many countries and cities, including Photohof, Salzburg, Gallery Photography Dublin, Photo Week Washington, Copenhagen Photo Festival, Centre de Beaux-Arts Brussels, and the Singapore Photo Festival, as well as representing Ireland at the Venice Biennale of Architecture. He's received numerous awards, including the Solace Award and bursaries from the Arts Council of Ireland, the AIB Prize, and has been shortlisted twice for the Lang Taylor Prize. He's joined this evening by Alan Moore, who describes himself as a retired HSC psychiatrist, an outdoor adventure sports enthusiast, and a member of environmental organisations, including SureCan and Hedgerows Ireland, both which are based in the local area here. His basic philosophy about environmental activism is that we all each have to choose what we are good at, whether that be lobbying elected representatives, manning pickets, planting trees, or putting up bird boxes. Everything is valid. And he says himself, he is still trying to navigate the best way and the most effective strategy to bring about change from his own personal point of view. So that's just a little background for those of you who didn't know Dara and Alan beforehand. So I'm going to hand over to Dara and Alan now to begin the conversation. And like I said, please put any questions you may have into the chat box on YouTube, and we'll put them to both Alan and Dara at the end. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the chat.
Thanks, Helena.
Thank you, Helena.
I'm going to immediately go into questioner mode with you, Dara, because I'm very honoured and flattered to have been asked to meet you virtually this evening to talk about your work and overlaps between my work and your work. But I'm very excited to ask you, first of all, to tell us a bit more about Project Clean Sweep and what started it, how did it happen, and a bit about the way that you've, as Helena said, managed to project beautiful landscapes for us to enjoy and then to reflect about their perhaps different and even sinister meaning. How did it all kick off?
Very boringly and very ordinary. I was in with my infant child at the time in 2011 in a local bar, and I picked up a newspaper and I saw a little byline saying that the Ministry of Defence have now announced that there are 14 sites in the United Kingdom that they don't know exactly what chemical weapons activity happened there. Now, like that, and like any other kind of stories or things I come across, I research into, see if they're viably photographic. With this Project Clean Sweep, I had the opportunity to go over and see those 14 sites. Funnily enough, each one of them had grid references, and I said, this is going to be easy. But when I got there, actually all the grid references were wrong, according to the locals and conversations and everything. But from that, it seemed to just open a whole can of worms about different sites all over the United Kingdom and beyond that. Basically I tried to differentiate between chemical and biological weapons, but the whole two programs seemed to overlap. So I decided to look at those two subject matters. So over a period of about 4 or 5 years, I was only fortunate to get away during the midterms, Easter holidays, because of having young children. But it made me do a lot of web-based research and written research into what happened on these sites. So when I did get the opportunity to go over there, I had the weight of knowledge on my shoulders. So I knew through Google Street Plans and Google Earth, I could actually navigate down to the actual spaces and see them before I actually went to photograph them. So the development technology over the last 15 years has been a godsend for my type of work, for researching. And, you know, what drew me to it? I think actually it was from a previous project between 2006 to 2008, I was fortunate enough to get into the former Maze prison up in Northern Ireland. That housed let's say, the most of the paramilitaries on both sides during the Trouble period in Northern Ireland. And part of that site was contaminated with lead because it had been used by the British Army as a firing range. And quietly, secretly, the OFM, the Office of First Minister, Deputy First Minister, who had control over the site after it had closed in about 2000 and 2003, they quietly brought in a contractor's company to actually decontaminate the land. And by conversations over a fence with the workers there, you know, they basically had to go in, decontaminate about 2 meters down into the soil, and basically cleanse it at a horrendous expense. It was all very much hidden, kept quiet to the public because it would be a scandal. 30 million being used on a small little site like this.
Sure.
So those two little things kind of connected with me and said, okay, the contamination of this very sinister site, the Maze prison, and now we have all these other sinister sites or these dark sites all over the United Kingdom that are majority overlooked. So that led to kind of discovering these sites in caravan parks, outside pubs, in recreational areas, industrial, suburban, in the middle of cities and towns. So yeah, it drew me into kind of these dark places with these dark underlying kind of sinister history. So I think that's where the whole kind of concept of Project Clean Sweep kind of developed over time. Now, it wasn't straight in, I knew what I was doing. There were so many kind of possibilities in the project that I had to kind of really draw up my own parameters of what I was doing, what was my limitations. Otherwise, you'd see me traveling to Belgium, France, looking at those contaminated sites from mustard gas during First World War, to sites over in Australia, Nigeria, Bahamas, America. It would have been, you know, a career's
life's work.
Life's work, yeah.
And Dara, you and I are going to explore in a few minutes what it is about you and me that drew us into environmental activism, whether childhood influences, what triggered that sort of interest in addressing things that appear to be wrong. But I wanted to ask you first about your methodology and the way in which you convey often very beautiful images with a hidden message. And to ask you, is that a conscious decision to, if you like, hook in the viewer by the beauty of your work, and then to discover by inference a deeper meaning? Because I ask you that because we had a previous conversation about political art and how some political artists are more heavy-handed and more overtly giving a message. But is it your intention as an artist to be subtler, or how has that process come about?
I consciously went out to actually counteract these dark places or dark spaces, because I wanted to kind of flip the narration, shall we say, a little bit. I wanted to kind of, let's say, put layers of meaning of the photograph, shall we say. So I had all these histories, all this interconnectedness. It was a matter of then me going out to these places time and time and time again, trying to kind of capture a kind of subversiveness. You know, there's, you know, kind of like a death and beauty, black and white, that kind of notion. I wanted that play in my photographs. I'm very, very much against a pretty picture, you know, because a pretty picture just means nothing to me, really means nothing to me. But by adding this extra layer on it, you're drawn into this beautiful image, and you know, it's aesthetic, it's beautiful, and then you read what's actually going on in the image or what happened in the image. It totally kind of subverts the initial meaning you have of the photograph. I knew I was going into a project that would possibly kind of lead to questions of authenticity. Back in about 2014, I went to one of these portfolio reviews with an expert in the photographic field, and he saw my initial 14 photographs, and he says to me, "Dara, I don't believe you."
Yeah.
And I said, "What do you mean you don't believe me?" "Well, you know, there was a lot of problematic things going on in photography, people lying, making up images."
Yeah.
So, I was very much, I felt it was a personal attack.
Yeah.
But when I thought about it a time later, I said, yeah, I have to prove myself here. I have to prove each and every site, I have to stand over it, that these events did happen.
Yeah.
And I suppose I put my images on a platform, and I made connections with academics, creative writers through this, and from those connections, I got to meet people in the Ministry of Defence who actually were custodians of these sites, custodians of the legacy of these weapons. So, instead of confronting them, I was able to present my findings in a conference setting and to question them and to question their beliefs. So, I mean, it actually broke down the ice very much in my relationship with them, that I could have a proper conversation with them, just as much as I could have a conversation with a real activist, shall we say.
Well, can I pick you up on that point? Because when you categorize yourself perhaps as not a real activist,
but still an activist, Alan.
Because it comes across to me very strongly that what you got involved in was a work of investigative journalism. Almost by accident, you were drawn into a process whereby you, on layer of dumping of toxic chemicals. So, I mean, I suppose that intrigues me because it makes me wonder the effect of your work, both on the Ministry of Defence and those who might have sought to hide your findings, but also on the wider public. What has the impact, to your knowledge, been on both?
I was fortunate enough to do a little experimental project with the University of Kent in Canterbury, and where we brought the photographs to 10 of these very rural, out of the way sites all over the UK. Basically the nearest village or little town to these sites. And we done social media postings on local Facebook sites, stuff like that. Got some activity kind of buzz going. We'd arrive in for a long weekend, arrive the Thursday, set up, get going on the Friday. We'd have a talk with the locals on the Saturday, and then we kind of deal with the residue, the other guest visitors. So we set up very much in a local context, in a place that was very comfortable for local people, because galleries, museums sometimes seem to be a barrier for a lot of people, that, there's nothing in connection between me and a museum or whatnot, or it might be a pretentious space, a lofty space. So we brought it to the people that it affected, the children of the people that affected. My agenda was to spread the love, really, and to get back. I mean, I had all expenses paid, which was great. But for the university, it was to basically get testimonials, personal testimonials of people living at these places, at these sites, stories that went around, tales, anecdotes, things like that.
But Dara, did you produce another reaction where local people shocked and horrified to discover what you had found?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I always find that there was 3 levels of understanding these places. One was, as you said, total shock. Other one was, yeah, I heard about it, but I'm not so sure, but I've heard stories, other stories. And people were very thankful for that. And then there was people who did know about it, and yeah, that's okay. you know, it's not a problem. I know about it. So,
Yeah.
you know, you those three levels of people. And what was funny as well, practically in every place, we got some conspiracy theorists coming in, talking about chemtrails, things like that, UFOs, things like that. So, you know, you always had that fringe element there.
And yes, of course. And I guess that's inevitable. But I'm just wondering if the effect of your work has had wider ramifications. Do you know whether the behavior of the Ministry of Defence or whoever has changed, or whether cleanups have been triggered as a result of your discoveries, or do you know?
Not mine particularly, as I know at the moment, but there was one activist who I interviewed. He's living in Weymouth in Dorset, right down the kind of middle centre of the United Kingdom along the south coast. His name is Mike Kenner, and Mike spent over 20 years. He claims himself to be a roll activist or a snail activist. So he's very much of the kind of the stereotypical kind of English road protester. And I had the fortune to interview him. He spent 20 years bombarding the Ministry of Defence for freedom of information releases of material. And after about, you know, he always heard that something went on, some sort of large scale experimentation in relation to biological weapons went on around the Dorset area, but he just didn't know. He got that information because he was a member of the military. He was in the Signals Corps many, many years ago. And through that, he formed a relationship with whoever was releasing that information in the Ministry of Defence. And they kept changing at least once a year. And sometimes they'd release too much information to Mike, or they trip up. And that was the key to him putting the whole thing together. And through that, through Mike Kenner's findings, BBC Panorama done a 3-hour program on his findings in the late 1990s. So I think there was another place called Nonsacook in Cornwall I came across, and through local activism that the government, the Ministry of Defence, decided to clean up the site. That's still ongoing. That started in 2011. So it's a long process. That was where Winston Churchill had a secret nerve agent factory in Cornwall, secret completely for 5 years, and then they closed it down after 5 years. Another interesting place, which has got a great story, I'll try and be as brief as possible, is Grenard Island near Ullapool, on the northwestern coast of Scotland. Little island, but it was used in anthrax experimentation in 1942, where scientists from the main scientific military organization of the British Army brought up 100 sheep there, tethered them at different distances on this 1 kilometer by 1.5 kilometer island, released anthrax bomb, and they killed the sheep. In the hurry up to clean up, all the officers went back, job completed, left the privates to clear up. A lot of them just chucked the sheep into the sea. That caused a knock-on effect. Some horses died on the mainland, but effectively that island was contaminated until the 1990s, when a kind of a radical group called the Dark Harvest Commandos, an affiliation of the Scottish National Liberation Army, which are also affiliated to the Irish National Liberation Army. They basically took soil samples from Grenard Island, put one outside the Ministry of Defence, put one outside Portendown, put one outside the Conservative conference in Blackpool, and one outside one of the royal residences.
Direct action, indeed.
Direct action. So I actually met one of those activists who was pounced on once that the act was done. Her house she was called by the police at that time. But through that action, it kind of got into local politics. They started raising it in Westminster, and through their actions, they actually did get it decontaminated in the 1990s.
So here's the thing, Dara, and sorry to, because I saw the pictures of Grenard Island in your exhibition, and they have that sublime beauty with that sinister under message, as we've already commented on. But I want to draw from your story of how this direct action had a clear political effect, and to explore a little bit with you a discussion we've had earlier about different forms of action and activism to effect change. And I'm thinking of the Martin Luther King notion that no great change is ever brought about without revolution, that the big changes that matter require significant action of quite at times overt. Even if it's peaceful, it needs to be in your face. As opposed to perhaps a subtler and a more thoughtful type of activism. Speaking for myself, I, like many people who have been drawn into the environmental world, activated by this ticking clock that we are reliably informed that time is not on our side to bring about change, and the size of change in terms of biodiversity and climate is so great that slow burn movements are unfortunately too slow.
Yeah.
And yet the dangers that seem to flow from this is that it can divide people. And you've talked already about the way in which people might mistrust the authorities through the discovery of dumping of toxic chemicals. How can we build trust? How can we foster trust amongst activist groups that that our message is the correct one, and how can we have a big effect when time is so short? What do you think?
That's a very difficult question to kind of tackle or actually even answer. I mean, as we're all familiar, there's many different ways of activism. It's really down to what you're against, or what are you concerned about?
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it should be appropriate to the circumstance.
Yeah.
I mean, with something environmental, it's very much of the moment. We're running out of time very much. So it's got to be more direct. It's got to be, I mean, we spoke earlier about Greta Thunberg, about how she kind of rallied children in Western society to go out and protest.
Yeah.
Early last year and the year before. And that was good, but it's not self-sustaining.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, she is a young woman, and she's very passionate about what she does.
Yeah.
But she is also in a very vulnerable position to be ridiculed, to be dismissed, like she has been by Donald Trump of those type.
Yeah.
But there's also a kind of a long-term activism. Somebody like Catherine Corliss and the Tuam Mother and Babies Home, and all the babies buried up there. That was years and years of Catherine Corliss doing thankless work, thankless research. And then with all this stuff coming out, when she did publish her findings, how much governments are always slow to act.
Yeah.
And they have to do feasibility studies, etc. But I think we are seeing movement on this. I mean,
well, yeah, no, I'm glad you sort of brought it back to the local, and Catherine would be a great example of somebody who has tirelessly worked on a cause and brought people with her and brought about a result. And I think one of the areas that we wanted to talk about a little bit was the local, and you've asked me to talk about what's been happening in Clonmel and the groups that I'm involved in. And the two groups that I particularly have been working with have been a group called Hedgerows Ireland. We were previously called Save Our Hedgerows. And we, I suppose classically, a group of us noticed that something didn't seem right, the way you've described your sort of eureka moment. And we found that the Irish Rail Company were removing many kilometers of native hedgerow in the course of replacing fencing. And we wondered why that was necessary, and we were pretty sure it wasn't necessary because it seemed that they could leave the hedgerow and put up the new fence beside it. But the impact of this national policy, as we discovered, was the net removal of many kilometres of hedgerows. And this led us to discover that hedgerows are perhaps our most single basic biodiversity resource in this country. We don't have a lot of woodlands in Ireland. Hedgerows are doubly or trebly important in terms of maintaining pollinator and insect and bird life and so on. They're corridors of biodiversity, and they're so important not only for beauty and sense of place, but they also sequester carbon, which is obviously at the heart of all our climate worries. They're good for flood control, they're good for, you know, the list goes on. But what we also discovered, and I think you've mentioned this too, the more you begin to research an area, the more you become familiar with data that you would never have guessed existed. And we discovered that hedgerows are almost unprotected in this country. Only in the nesting season do they have indirect protection against cutting and being grubbed out. So the law is incredibly weak. We also discovered that the agencies who should be in a position to do something, for example, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, are hopelessly under-resourced and have all sorts of issues with their management and governance. So our small group got hooked into this subject and have become a national body and have managed to meet 2 government ministers in the last few months and are fighting hard to make a change. But I suppose our work is an example of a local grassroots, hedge roots organization that is now looking to punch above its weight. It's that classic David and Goliath phenomenon that I think seems to be so characteristic of environmental movements, that it starts small. I was looking at an amazing documentary about the beginning of the Greenpeace movement, and you may remember those iconic images of the small rubber dinghies that were crisscrossing in front of the whaling ships. And what a powerful image of a tiny, tiny dots facing up to these huge whaling Russian ships. So, I mean, I suppose in a long-winded way, I'm talking about how we can make a difference from the local going right up to the top. And I suspect you need everything. You need a bottom up, but you need a top down, because we have to change policy. Our ant-like work will never have an effect if we can't actually stop fossil fuels being used, change the way agriculture is practiced. So that's what we've learned. And you know, I just wonder, again, coming back to the artistic element of this, and the use of and even the exploitation perhaps of imagery and of and pictures and the use of language to achieve an effect. Is that a misuse of art, do you think, Dara, or is this all fair in love and war?
I was going to try and pop in a question there for you in relation to activism, because you started on a local scale and then you found all these other groups who had similar concerns, and you did make a representation as a kind of almost like a collection of local bodies within a national time frame, that you were able to meet 2 ministers. I think ye being a small group would never have been affected beyond local politics.
Yeah.
But you were being a national, coherent group. You wanted X, Y, and Z, or 1, 2, 3 aims to do, that your voice was heard. Did you feel that, Alan?
Yes, we did. We felt listened to, and you know, we do sincerely believe that some of our ideas may see their way into policy. But you've touched on a really raw nerve, which is the idea of, well, in this country in particular, and I think it's probably a wider phenomenon, there are so many small local groups all doing much the same thing. And in the environmental movement, if you start to Google hedgerows or trees or regenerative farming, there is a multiplicity of small groups, some bigger, some smaller, all overlapping very much in their aims and ambitions. And there is a sense of inefficiency and of a dilution of efforts, which, if you're a cynic, you would say plays into the hands of those who would wish to carry on with business as usual.
Yeah.
So there is that tension between, that famous book, Small is Beautiful, that looked at that very issue, that if groups get too big and get too politicized and committee laden, then they lose. But equally, they have to be big enough to make a change. So I don't know. We're still working on it.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing. If it gets too much of a colossus, then it becomes an institution in itself, and it can then distance the local groups against national policy, shall we say. So yeah. There is that problem of balancing both being seen and heard in a national platform, but also keeping that local connection as well. And I think I made it through those I mean, when you're talking about this, I think my project actually links all these little local sites all around the UK into a coherent body or coherent comment on landscape. And I think then art, it's, art, I mean, I have distanced myself personally. It's now its own entity.
Yeah.
It tells its own story. I don't have to be a spokesman anymore for it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing. I think if activism, that's when, some environmental issue has gone completely mainstream. Like people, are not buying plastic bags anymore for this. First thing that comes into my head. And it's uncool to buy plastic bags because now it's cool to have your reusable bag.
Yeah.
So that, okay, it was a government policy that was brought in, but I think environmental groups were calling for a long, long time for plastic bag levies or things like that. So.
Yeah, and I mean, you've touched on the point, I think, that I would agree with, that so often government policy lags behind public opinion. And that seems so true. For example, within the pandemic, there has been so much written and felt about the need to look after our environment. It's all over social media, and we can come to social media, but there's still a sense that the public wants to see more protection, more promotion of all these changes, but the policymakers are lagging behind, and that is frustrating.
Yeah, they're not willing to make that change because change costs. And where does that cost come? It comes from the taxpayers. So if you're hitting the taxpayers, then the taxpayers won't vote for that politician who's in power the next time. So it's, I mean, you can say politicians are in this fine line of pulling the party line, but also dealing with the locale or their constituency as well, and having to be voted in or hoping to be voted in the next election. So it's a very difficult, but I mean, I think we should take examples of success stories that have happened.
Yes, I agree. And I do think this, goes back to the lobbying that we mentioned. That, I mean, I think as a local and individual action, all of us can make a difference through, through leaning on politicians and questioning them and so forth. But yes, there are great positive stories, as you've said. And this is a gloomy topic. If you forget to acknowledge the good stuff, and there is great stuff, and we could talk about that. But I wanted to ask you a bit about where your activism comes from, because I'm going back to the personal in this. When you were sitting in that pub, or when you read that Guardian report on Project Clean Sweep, what was it about you that wanted to find out more, and where does that come from in you?
I suppose, I mean, like yourself, Alan, I came from a village outside Limerick, which is now consumed by Limerick. But at that time, when I was a young fella growing out, it was like, Dara, go out the door. I don't want to see you until darkness.
Yeah.
So it was a matter of, because there was fields, whatever, I'd be running through fields, with my friends playing. So from then, there has always been a sense of nature, being outdoors, has always been kind of second nature to me.
Yeah.
And so I think it's coming from that. But activism, I suppose, like any young person, you know, I grew up at the time when there was, you know, the threat of nuclear Armageddon. You know, I was part of CND as a young person. But I felt that these organizations weren't effective. I think that they change. I think, you know, I wasn't going to change the world. I figured that out pretty quickly. But I could change the world in other ways, by subtle ways.
Yeah.
Being an artist, not being pigeonholed into specific things, and being able to be creative within the subject matter I'm dealing with. So, I mean, having that artistic freedom, I think, not pinning my pegs to any mast.
Yeah.
And being free and flexible to go talk to one group to the next. I think that was very important, because the older I get, I think things are not yes and no, right and wrong. There's 20 million shades of gray in between.
Yeah, that's such a big point. And I mean, I sort of threw in the agriculture word because farmers are getting such a kicking for their perceived contribution to climate change in this country. But it's so complicated because the kind of farming that's practiced is as a result of so many other effects, and it's like a chain of events, and therefore you know, to attack somebody who is at the end of that chain is just so wrong and misunderstands the point so much. Bad policy, bad leadership, lobbying by corporate interests, and all that plays into. So the complexity of it, as you say, as we get older, it gets more evident in all these questions. But like you, and I think you've taken me back to another subject that intrigues me, which is early influences. You, like I did, had the freedom to roam and to sample the countryside without being, you know, health and safety, and all the changes that have made it harder for young people to run wild were very important. And I said to you in a message earlier that I'm very struck by the power of these early influences, and how, again, we can do something to change that. The sterility and the bleakness and the barrenness of so many of our public spaces, schools and car parks and town centres and churches and churchyards, the predominance of concrete and tar macadam quite unnecessarily creates an environment which children inevitably are influenced by. Why would you want to save something if you've never been in it or enjoyed it? So, you know, these are other powerful changes that can be made. And in another campaign, Sure Can, the other group that Helena mentioned that I belong to, is, you know, we work with the local authorities, and we have huge praise and you know, warm feelings towards the local authority in the good things that they do, and they are doing good things. And the Tipperary Blue Way is a great example. But equally, we're unafraid to be critical. And for example, the current town plan for Clonmel that is due to revolutionize it in a good way also includes removing all the trees from the town centre and replacing them with nice new ones of a different species. And that's a classical example of the kind of thing that planners, who so often are engineer-based and have no interest in ecology and the value of a semi-mature tree, get wrong. So, you know, we are, as a group locally, Sure Can, looking at the local environment and trying to make small changes that might have bigger knock-on effects in the future. So, I mean, I kind of wanted to also come to the question of landscape and how it informs our practice. It may follow a bit from that last question, and to ask you, you know, how does landscape inform your photographic artistic work up to now?
I mean, while you were kind of rounding up that question, I started thinking about, let's say I'd done my master's in my early 30s, and what I kind of studied a lot and got to discover then was psychogeographers, basically people like Ian Sinclair, Robert McFarlane, who basically went into the landscape, experienced it, conveyed it in their writings. Not just what they see, oh, there's a pretty tree, but, you know, the layers of history, the interconnectedness of the land, the psychological effects of being in the landscape and how it actually changes you. And actually you become, the longer you are in it, the more you become of it. And unfortunately, we live in a very sterile world where we're facing a screen every day. We're parking in concrete car parks because we're not walking from A to B. We're driving from one part or concrete driveway to the concrete shopping mall. And it's all of the same from A to B. So, but just to step out of that, to feel, to experience the landscape as a psychological kind of experience is a fantastic thing. And I think people like those writers have been very instrumental in how I think about what I photograph in the landscape. The different elements, different items that make up the landscape. Why do they have a proliferation of these trees here? So I'll go and ask, and there's possibly a history behind that could connect to my story I'm trying to tell. So, I mean, that's kind of my approach to the landscape. That's how I feel. I have a kind of a personal attachment to the landscape. And the thing is, you know, I go on holidays. I don't go to famous churches or things. I would like to rather walk around the suburbs or industrial regions to see the real, you know, place, not what the tourist board says. I want to eat what the real people eat. So I'm the worst person to bring on holidays. So, you know, so there's a fascination in the overlooked, in the unexplored or ignored, shall we say?
Yes.
Would we say the same about you, Alan?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that my sort of, I was very lucky to grow up. My dad was a psychiatrist in St. Patrick's Hospital in Dublin, and he was a huge influence on me for all sorts of reasons. He was a quiet campaigner, and he was a countryman, and he, apart from being a doctor, he had a huge love of the countryside. But he brought us up in a house belonging to the hospital that was bang in the middle of a 500-acre dairy farm, back in the day when all the psychiatric hospitals had their own farms. So that day is gone, but I was very lucky because I grew up on a farm that was in the Liffey Valley, and it was a heavily wooded and beautiful place. And it gave me, I'm sure, that early love of landscape that is driving me on now. And, you know, Helena mentioned another interest area of mine, which is outdoor adventure sports, and I'm involved in Clonmel Mountain Bike Club. And one of the positives of lockdown, and there are some of these, has been to see the number of young kids getting out on bikes in the hills around Clonmel. It's been actually explosive and dramatic, and it counters again, I suppose, the experience of, I mean, standard sport is great, and of course, ball sports and team sports and pitch-based sports have a fantastic role, but it has been to the detriment of the kind of running wild experience that you and I have had. An unstructured roaming around the countryside on a bike or on 2 feet has been a great thing. And again, it brings kids into contact with landscape and with trees. And I have a bit of a name. I'm sort of, I suppose, affectionately known as being a bit of a tree hugger. And I hope it's affectionate. But, you know, I do try to bang on a bit about, you know, look at these native trees and how much wildlife they're sustaining compared to that stand of Sitka spruce that has nothing growing underneath it. And trying to sort of interpret the landscape a little bit and understand, as you said earlier, about why it is the way it is and why one might be more attractive or more productive or more important than another. So it is, I think, about early influences. For me, it's about trying to give back and to share something that I feel is important. I mean, there is I don't know to whom this is attributed, but there is that famous quote about people won't want to save if you don't know about something, and if you don't understand it, then why would you want to preserve it and to to see it continue? So I think that one of our missions locally in the groups I belong to is to try to get to get younger people involved. Like in SureCan, again, going back to this environmental group, we're involved in a project getting rid of invasive species up and down the River Suir. We have quite an infestation of a number of plants that are either dangerous or taking over from native plants. But we've been joined by groups of school kids and overseas students in recent years. And again, we would hope that this will have a future impact, and that the kind of lessons that are being learned will feed into the development of kids who want to make a difference. Because you talked about Greta Thunberg and all the responsibility on her shoulders as a single person, and how that's that feels a bit unbalanced and a bit dangerous. But equally, I suppose, because of her youth and the fact that she is only 19 and was 16 when she started this, she has brought with her a whole generation of young people who might not have identified with David Attenborough, I suppose, to take the other end of the spectrum.
No, that I would certainly agree that's that is one thing that will be long lasting, is that she has brought her contemporaries with her, have woken up a little bit, shall we say, to the crisis we have at this moment in relation to climate change and the environment. So yeah, go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
And I was just looking at our list, and we have a few minutes left, and we vaguely thought that we might towards the end look to the future a little bit, and in your work and in what we're doing here in Clonmel, and how we can kind of plan the next stage in our activism. Where are you going with your work next? Or is that, I didn't purse this question, so it may be a trick one, but have you got stuff on the back boiler?
I do. I am working with history again, but a kind of a different history. I have an exhibition that's just opened last week at the Crawford Art Gallery, and that deals with the sites where people lost their lives during the Irish War of Independence. So the formula is quite similar. It's a lot of research, a lot of background. Unfortunately enough, I was photographing in my city, but I think I'm going to leave that for a while and go back and then reinterrogate the landscape in another form. I haven't yet found out, it's a trial and error over the next month, over the next year or two, to find something that will work photographically or visually, because not all things work visually. When you get down to it. But there are a couple of topics that are floating around, that I'm researching. So to be honest, Alan, I can't pin myself down exactly.
Yeah, and nor us either, because I think we're sort of the groups I'm involved in are evolving organically and trying to see what works and what doesn't work. But I think more than anything, to try to avoid that them and us sort of position that alienates as many people as it brings on board, because one thing seems clearer than any in all this activism, which is that it should not be political. There's no reason, no excuse for politicizing what is a planet problem. And the grotesque spectacle that we see, for example, in America, where environment is the preserve of the Democratic Party, and the fossil fuel lobby is the preserve of the Republicans. I mean, how crazy an example of politics at its most useless could you find? So, I mean, I'm a member of the Green Party, as it happens in this country, but I'd see no point in, the environment being a green issue exclusively. That is a
society's issue.
For
it's
failure.
Society's issue. It's not political. It's society's issue.
It is society's issues.
And people like yourself need to just keep reiterate it, keep repeating yourself, because I think eventually the word will spread. Activism will take on another route, and I think there will be change somewhere down the line.
I think there's change already, Dara. I'm certain that the problem with once you get involved in this, it's difficult sometimes not to see the good stuff, because you get sensitized to the guy who's spraying his yard with Roundup and the verge all along the ditch, and that's the bit that maybe leaps out. But it's easy to miss the fact that his neighbor is planting a native hedge, and I think that truly there are more good things happening than bad. And I think it's not just young people. I think it's older people who are waking up and trying something different. And, I mentioned before the number of groups around the country that are doing good stuff. And while that may be sort of isolated individual efforts, they do all add up to a mass movement. And I'm certain, and the optimist in me, and I think the realist, is seeing that we are at the crest of a wave that is about to break in the form of major change, perhaps worldwide. But let's concentrate on the Irish situation. Now, I'm aware that we're about 4 minutes from the end, and Helena is coming back in, I think, probably to send us home. And
no, you're not sending you home just yet. I'm just going to jump in with this question from one of our YouTube viewers. And it's from Teresia, and she's just kind of stating how many of us admire pristine lawns and well-kept gardens, and wondering, have we lost our connection to nature and what is beautiful? But probably, I presume that's coming from some of the topics you've touched on in relation to the sublime and things like that, and that balance. And maybe, like you said, Alan, the guy with the Roundup who's beside the guy with the wildflowers,
Yeah. Well, it's a big one. I don't know. Will I kick off on that, Dara?
Please do.
Because Teresia has touched on something that we didn't really mention, maybe, which is the influence of fashions and trends, and maybe the need to change the way that we look at our environment and what is seen as an attractive landscape, as opposed to an unattractive one. The trend, I think, has been typically in farmland for the short back and sides hedge, because that looks nice and neat. But that's changing, because we're realizing that that's not really very good for the environment. In the garden that Teresia mentions, we have had generations of neatness and perhaps sterility and vast expanses of lawn, but you can't open a magazine or a paper or look at a gardening program now without being told about the value of wildflower meadows and letting things go a bit. And it's maybe about changing the fashion. I mean, we haven't used the word fashion, but it does play a role. People influence each other, and how we look at a garden and what we think is beautiful is changing. It certainly, I think, needs to change. Dara?
I think our fashion, shall we say, of having a nice front and back garden all mowed and everything is really a colonial thing, when we aspire to basically the lords and ladies and their grand lawns, shall we say. So there was always that connection towards that. So yes, I think, I myself personally haven't cut my lawn on a regular basis now for about 3-4 years, but the amount of activity of birds and bees out in my garden has been fantastic. Okay. And they probably think I'm all mad along my row of houses, but I think it's fabulous. I think it's fabulous because now that my children are young, they're out interacting in the garden. Yeah. Something flies up to them. I said, don't worry about it. That won't hurt you. But if it wasn't for me letting that garden grow, I wouldn't have that. I'd just have a sterile lawn.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned children, Dara, because I think at the heart of this, if you look at a garden, children want a wild, mysterious place where they can hide and tunnel through. A sterile mown lawn is not much fun if you're an imaginative, creative kid. And here I'm parroting my wife, who's a garden designer, and her sort of, her real passion is to see more gardens with wild spaces and thickets of hazel and so on. And they don't have to look messy. You can have a lawn with a mown path through it that can look really cool and trendy. And so it doesn't have to be shaggy and, tell the neighbors that you don't care. So again, I think it's changing, and the media is great at bringing those changes about by showing how much better it can look.
Yeah, and I think you're both right in that that notion of trends that you mentioned, Alan. You see it even in the kind of the newspaper, magazine media. Even at that level, once something, if you have the likes of celebrity gardeners talking about letting things go and letting the lawn turn to moss, if you have that kind of agenda seeping into that mainstream, it won't be long before people kind of latch onto it. And as well, to segue into a little project that we're doing currently, which is our pollinating pastures project with Christine Mackey as part of our project in September. And we're sending out packets and packets and packets and packets of native Irish wildflower seeds, with the idea that, again, getting families engaged, get a little patch in your garden, grow them. And again, it's fun, but also will hopefully help people to kind of spend a bit of time with it, have a look at it, get the kids involved, and you only have to maybe even use a few pots or dig out a bit of the lawn. But all these little incentives that are, whether they're coming from the mainstream media, whether they're coming from maybe an art context or an activism context, that we could all work together to affect change in little ways that will make bigger and bigger impacts as it kind of expands and expands. So I suppose that's what we all hope, really, at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Small changes adding up to big ones, I think, has to be the way forward. And the fusion of art and environment, which I'm glad you brought us back to, it seems to be a really fundamental bringing together of two great forces and, producing something good. And I know that you and Cleanfit, your counterpart in the Project Arts Festival, have a very strong mission to bring those elements together. And more of that, please.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I do think that the arts has always been, I suppose, all activism has affected the arts, and arts have been involved in activism throughout history. And I think that climate change and all of these things immediately impact everybody. It's not just artists and not just environmentalists. And I think that sometimes art can be, I suppose, an entry point for some people to get into something that maybe it's a doorway to, as opposed to being told what to do or being preached to. Everybody, some people like that, some people don't. So again, it's just another avenue for exploration. And sometimes it can come up. I find, like with Dara, even with this project, the idea of even the amount of time that went into the research and the attention to detail about how to approach this and how to actually communicate it. Like the communication is what an artist decides to do. The artist really does think about how they communicate something, and that can be either through something very beautiful, something very funny, something very serious, and it can get different audiences and hopefully tug on heartstrings or make people laugh or make people want to research more. So I think there's loads of scope within all of that. So I'm going to wrap up for this evening, if that's okay with everyone. And thank you to everyone who joined us live on YouTube for our closing chat with Dara McGrath and Alan Moore. And like I said, hopefully we'll hear more from these two as projects continue on, and we'll get to work with Dara again, hopefully. And best of luck with the rest of the show in Cork, Dara.
Thank you.
Hopefully now people will get in the door to see it, which is great.
Yes.
Fantastic. And look, everyone have a very nice bank holiday weekend. And again, big thanks to Dara McGrath and Alan Moore for joining us this evening, and to Emer King.
Helena.
Yes.
Can I just plug Hedgerows Ireland? Hedgerowsireland.org is the name of the website. We were so busy talking our heads off that we didn't share screens, but I would be remiss if I didn't direct people to our website, hedgerowsireland.org.
Fantastic. Anything else you want to plug there, Dara?
Yes, actually, my book, the book to accompany the exhibition, It's on sale on my website, daramcgrath.com. That's D-A-R-A, daramcgrath.com. Thank you.
Great, and the link should be on our website as well. So we'll end there. So hedgerows.com or daramcgrath.com. Get going. And for both of the websites, we'll have more information as those hours in relation to Dara's work. Great, and thank you to Alan, thank you to Dara, and thank you to everyone who watched this evening.
Thank you both.